So it looks like we're going to have a conversation amongst ourselves, which is, sometimes in a conference like this, in a big conference like this, can be very difficult to get. So we're going to make the best of circumstances, and we're going to have a very informal. So what Jyotsna and I had planned was actually quite different. So we're going to do it slightly differently. We will still have the panel. We are running a little late, but we will end on time. So for those of you who are in this panel, it will end at 3:45. First so what we will do is we will have a sort of an informal conversation, and I'll try and mediate it as much as possible, although I think you're such erudite speakers, that's probably not necessary. So I'll start by inviting Avani to the stage. I just saw you. There you are. Okay. Rohit Dhankar, Srinath Reddy, Sarojini. Please come to the dais. It would be great. I think everyone would love to hear from you. And I'll try and moderate from here. I think the disadvantage most of us have for panel sessions, regardless of any conference, is that you tend to get to miss out on at least one of the invited speakers, right? You have to, physically not yet possible to be in two places at once. So that's one of the, I wanted to give you a sense of why we decided to have this panel, because I think for those of us who have not been, in the conversations in the other panels, it's kind of good to hear from you, especially on the themes, the specific themes that you are engaged in, or you were engaged in throughout the conference, as well as in individual parallel sessions. So, like I said, we have about 40-45 minutes, and I would really like all of you to kind of engage with the kinds of things that you felt were very relevant. One, to the idea of institution building, institution sustenance. As well, that could be larger than, yes, we engaged with CBPS as an institution and independence, and, Aruna Roy, Shanta Sinha spoke a little bit about, and especially the panel that was in the opening plenary also spoke about, how do you start engaging with conversations around democracy, around the public, the idea of public, or the idea of independence, and how do we sort of start to unpack it, or start to, unpacking it is one aspect of it, but also how to engage with it. So my larger, the larger question that I have for each of you is, in that context, in the context of all that you've heard, in all the comments that you've seen, as well as the conversations that you've had in your parallel sessions, what would be the most significant sort of conversations that you would like at least those assembled to take forward or to engage with? And this is especially true for young scholars who are here. Because I think a lot of the time we do want to, one is, what we've kind of experienced, but also the anecdote that I have is, Sandhya Menon was the feminist who passed away about 5 years ago. She said, she was talking to me, and she said a lot of the work that we did, we focused so much on the law. So this was about feminism and what kind of, and during that time, there was this whole conversation we were having about intergenerational feminism, what kind of lessons are we learning? And I was telling her, and I don't know if I convinced her, that, standing on the shoulders of giants is also, it is a responsibility, and it's a duty, and it's really useful, because if that conversation around legal aspects of the law didn't take place, then there was no way of saying, okay, the state now is held responsible for violence that is happening in private homes, because till that point, that conversation didn't happen. So yes, the battles are not yet done. We're still fighting, as Honorary said, we should fight. But I think the mandate, I guess, for this panel, for you, especially in the kind of conversation that I would like to take forward, is what do you feel are the sort of agenda-setting things that in your domain areas you feel is critical for young scholars to take forward, and also for us as an institution to start to engage with? Now, whether that's theoretical themes, empirical questions, anything that you feel we need to be mindful of. So thank you. And we can go with any order in Avani was very clear that she didn't want to be first. So we can start with Dr. Reddy. given we'll go this way then.
I thought I had positioned myself out of your line of vision. But it appears that it was not adequate.
No, it's just that at the either end you're kind of susceptible to.
I know. The tales of the distribution. Yes. Well, I think for me it was a learning experience. I came here to learn, to listen, learn, and leverage my own knowledge and build on that. And I think that was very useful for me. I think yesterday there was a great deal of discussion in the sessions I attended, obviously not both the parallel sessions, but the main plenary sessions, where there was clear concern about where the country is going, how academia and independent institutions of learning are getting increasingly vulnerable and therefore muted in their expression of views. And the question was whether we can afford to do that and continue to get further silenced. But I think there was also a clear-cut call in terms of knowledge being generated that we need a lot more of multidisciplinary learning to be translated effectively into multi-sectoral application. And that this requires very active engagement with, support to, and participation of the community. And therefore, it is important for academia to not only look at community as an object of study, but as a very important participant and partner in the whole job of knowledge creation, knowledge translation, implementation, and even monitoring. I think that came out fairly clearly. In terms of multidisciplinary learning and research, while I think that is something that is very eloquently subscribed to by most people, the incentives and disincentives for that were not adequately discussed, and I don't think there was an opportunity to do that. Why is it that despite wanting to do that, many institutions do not do it? Because of siloed funding streams, which are actually focused only on certain subject areas, the lack of incentives for promotion, because if you are doing a multidisciplinary research and multi-institutional research at that, how do you split the credits? How do you get the credits for academic promotion? So all of them ultimately force you into a narrow stream because you're trying to pursue your own academic career as well. So what are the kind of institutional reforms that are required for that? And that's going to be very important. I think the other element is that since this kind of multidisciplinary research requires a great deal of exploration with multiple streams of knowledge coming in, it is very important to actually build partnerships among institutions and not necessarily believe that one single institution can drive that process forward. And how do we do that? By creating an ecosystem which is not vulnerable to the ecosystem. I think that is going to be an important element that we must address. But I think what really made me very pleased that I came is not only to hear the people yesterday crying out for a change in the overall social climate so that the current stifling environment is somehow loosened. But much more importantly, the active engagement of young researchers who are displaying both their talent and commitment to pursue knowledge and to try and find areas where they can apply it best for public good. The fact that it is public good that is coming up uppermost is very clear. And it's not just merely personal gratification, which researchers are usually accused of, but the idea of actually doing it for public good. One area we did not actually explore, even when we are talking about governance or about knowledge creation or knowledge application, is where do these public-private partnerships fit in? Currently, at the moment, what is their ethos? What is their governance structure? What are the deliverables? What are the accountability mechanisms, particularly public accountability? Those are issues we have not discussed, I think, in adequate depth, and that needs to be discussed. We believe that PPP should ideally be redefined as partnership for a public purpose. So define the public purpose, define the deliverables, and clearly delineate the accountability mechanisms. And then only we'll be able to achieve the objective, recognizing that all stakeholders in society must combine their energies for public good. But while health is recognized clearly as a market failure, we still see the market forces now encroaching much more prominently into health and other areas of public good as well. So that is where I think we must really see where independent institutions can actually generate knowledge, but also stoke public awareness as to how that can be somehow calamitous for us, but offer also well-argued alternatives. I think there was sufficient strength in what was done in this conference. Obviously, a 2-day conference or 1.5-day conference cannot achieve all those objectives, but I think every moment that I spent here was both enlightening and energizing. So thank you very much.
I would echo what Dr. Reddy said, that every moment has been very, very rewarding and a huge learning experience. I'll talk a little bit about the role of independent institutions in a more limited way in the context of the panel that I was associated with, which was on gender in public spaces. The reason I want to do that is because I think that gender and women in the old sense actually related to independent institutions in a way different to many sectors. The women's movement has always had a very close relationship with the nature of change in what happened to women in legislation and the effect of schemes. And this didn't start today. It started with the Mathura rape case, we have the Nirbhaya thing, we have the Justice Verma committee. I mean, all that has come as a result of public voices, public articulation of the need for change. That is something which is a space which I think we had very strong movement. I think the voices are becoming less one doesn't, I mean, it's not possible to be as vocal as one was, but I think it's something that one needs to bear in mind, and it hasn't always been through the route of public action. It has also been through the route of change through public legislation, etc. All the changes, if you think of the Vishaka case, that's the result of a PIL that was actually filed by Naina Kapur, and it resulted in first the sexual harassment guidelines and later led to POSH. So what I'm saying is that there is a role, whether it's for the judiciary, for the movement, and for NGOs, to actually bring about change. And I'm talking about it because one is the change in legislation, which is structural. But there is also a huge change, and that is also where role can be played, is being played, has been played by civil society. Civil society has often, through pilots, through interventions, demonstrated how things could work, need to be done. Just now, there's this foundation called Transform Rural India Foundation. And for instance, in Madhya Pradesh, it started off by setting up in a cluster, a place for justice for sexual harassment at a cluster level in district for a Nari Shakti Kendra. That was picked up and has been replicated throughout the state. So what I'm saying is it's a model that was set up by TRIF, which was picked up and replicated. So let's not think we can't. The issue is, of course, when civil society does stuff, is the issue of scale. TRIF fortunately has that relationship with the government in 4 states and in the government of India in certain ministries, that it can bring about scale. That's the thing, but we can certainly, as civil society, influence the way things are done. The other thing, we had to, just drawing again on yesterday's experiences, there were some, I would say, excellent papers. Of course, they're not completed, but there were such excellent papers. I also have something to do with a civil society organization in Delhi. I work with others. And I always find one of the things that I would say bothers me, and also I feel we need to think a lot about, is the fact that there is excellent work out there. And there's a lot of work that needs to be heard by policymakers. Somehow, I feel that closing of the loop is something that we are not actually very effective. I belong to a feminist policy collective. They send things to the ministry, etc., etc. But I really think, and I want to go back to, the role of the media now, is I actually think that articles in the press have much more readership and actually are taken note of by whoever. It's very, very interesting. You see an article which says something about some policy in the Indian Express. The following day you get something from a government person trying to, in a cloak term, government person or somebody who's been put up by government. So that's being taken care of. That's being noticed. So I would say, rather than erudite journals, which yes, they have to be also published in, but convert it into something which can be taken care of. I find now so many articles are being referred to all the time, what is, this thing from such and such newspaper, etc. So I would just say that closing the loop is really, really important. And I sometimes think, there are organizations like CBGA, CBPS, ISST, coming out with excellent policy briefs. Sometimes I think maybe there should be some kind of a platform where we do very systematically dissemination of this, because there's a lot of good work. Lastly, I'll talk a little bit about the academic role. Of course, there is 2 streams. One is the fact that, honestly, in the government universities, there are they still continue, the women's studies centers. Their output has been something that is not necessarily very visible. It varies from university. But I think that's some place where one could work with and start looking at trying to make some alliance so they produce something. I would lastly just say one thing. There is the role of independent institutions, but it's amazing how within governmental structures, there are individuals make a huge difference, whether it's in government or otherwise. And I think, especially for gender, it's very important to find out who your allies are. You will find allies there. I'm sure anybody who's worked in gender will know allies in government who have pushed an agenda, male, female. And I think that's something we need to work with, because when we are talking about policy discourse, it's amazing the kind of impact that can have. So I just feel that being able to know who those allies are is very, very important, because I can think, and I'm sure if I do, that's how change comes about. I think I'll stop there. That's enough. Thank you.
Good afternoon, friends. Originally, I was thinking of talking about something else, particularly highlighting my penchant with more clearly defined idea of independence. But now, since time is very little, so I'll focus. I work in education, and particularly voluntary agencies who are involved with school education directly. So I'll focus from there, and maybe some of what I say might be generalizable. If I come directly to the role, it seems to me that about policy, critique, research, implementation, and advocacy. Within advocacy, I particularly think that we are not using Right to Education Act legally. I mean, we are not using enough. There are, if you go to the schools in the rural area, it could definitely be proved that what the RT talks about, that is not happening in the school, and that is legislable, and we are not taking it forward. So I consider that also as part of. But at the same time, when you are working and this idea of independence is, or the top of the mind of the people, and the government happens to be, all governments are, but this particular government happens to be somewhat not very happy about critique, etc., then there could be several different kinds of scenarios which can emerge, and that I believe we will have to take care of. I'll take an example, an imaginary scenario, and we'll try to make certain points about what I want to say, particularly on defining it more clearly, the idea. Imagine two sets of voluntary organizations. We recently have had our education policy, new education policy. Now, all over India, new curriculum frameworks are being developed. NCERT is taking the lead, and every state, many of them have published part of the documents, and others are prepared. Now imagine there are two sets of voluntary agencies, what we call these days NGOs, two sets of NGOs who have adequate expertise in developing curriculum, deciding about various kinds of relationship between aims of education and pedagogy, as well as content and all that. They have expertise in that, as well as teacher training and developing this thing. One set of these NGOs is highly critical, suppose, of the new education policy. And on very legitimate grounds, they might feel, I'm not saying that there is really such a set of NGOs, but imagine that they feel that the new education policy foregrounds the economic development aims, gives priority to them over the critical citizen development aims. And they have part of their mandate as their registration, etc., emphasize more on the development of critical citizen and awareness of people about equality, social justice, etc. And they feel that this policy is lacking in giving adequate importance to that. Part one. Second, suppose that they also feel that policy has no business of listing what should be in the curriculum. Policy should simply give, this is their idea of policy, national education policy, that policy should simply give the guidelines for selecting the curricular content, not list the curricular content. And last, suppose they are very resentful of policy advocating a particular pedagogy, because pedagogies are always controversial, and there could be more than one pedagogy for the same educational aims, etc. This is part one. Now there is another set of NGOs who appreciate whatever is written in this policy and completely together with the government, with the policy, forget about the government, together with the policy, and they agree with everything is happening in this. NCERT and SCERTs are responsible for developing curriculum or curricular frameworks and material, etc. Naturally, the set B would be preferred, and set A, in that sense, actually would be sidelined. Personally, I feel that NCERT or SCERT or the government would be legitimate in doing that, and that's not an injustice with that first set of NGOs. Why do I feel that? Because the government has come up with a policy. That set of NGO may not agree that the policy came through the fair democratic procedure and through the consultations, etc. And this is now accepted by the cabinet or whomsoever, whatever the authority in that, and therefore this is the policy, and the government has the right to make that policy. Now, my constitutional right as the part of the set A NGO is also there, that I can disagree with this policy, I can critique this, I see that this is take our education in the wrong direction, I see that this will ruin our curriculum and pedagogy. So this is my right as a citizen. I can talk about it, but can I claim that the government should take me on board in this process of developing a new curriculum framework because they want their curriculum framework to be consistent with the policy? So it seems to me that so far I as an NGO may feel very dissatisfied with it, but I don't seem to have ground to say that either I am sort of some injustice has happened with me. Let's go to the next level. Suppose set A NGO, I am pretty happy with this thing. Okay, if you want to develop a curriculum of this nature, go ahead. But I take the job of research and critique and publishing articles and publishing research, etc., which actually shows the problems with the curricula and policy. And now the government stops my funding from another project. Now, I think here something is happening, and this is the time when perhaps we should come together and try to resist it. There could be a third thing. This is not my funding is stopped, the government funding. Suppose I don't take any funding from the government. But suppose my FCRA is cancelled and court cases are instituted against me for income tax. Now I think the government is acting, trying to victimize this particular set of NGOs. This last thing, it seems to me, that requires one more strain in thinking about independence. So far, since yesterday, we have been talking about the external pressure on the NGOs or independent bodies to guard their independence. I have been saying since yesterday, my question was also related, there is another aspect to it. Shouldn't we reflect on our own ways of functioning and whether we have a clear kind of mandate in terms of our objectives and our commitment to objective rational research and making a rational judgment? Or are we being, let me go back to my NGOs. Suppose this first set of NGOs are extremely critical of this policy, but the points they bring out to be critical about this policy were already there in 68 policy and 86 policy. Now there seems to be an issue with the independence of the NGO itself internally. Because if a certain provision is there in a policy by government A, this NGO doesn't seem to be critical of this and they accept it pretty happily. And if a similar kind of provision by the government B, it seems that now the vision and the objectivity of the NGO itself is compromised because their political agenda and direct party political agenda is taking over. So the strand I want to say is that first, we have to be true to our objectives, and second, we have to reflect on ourselves. Last thing I would say is that how can small NGOs, I mean, this organization is too big for us, how can small NGOs maintain their independence? I think there are 3 or 4 very simple things. One is as I already said, commitment to the objectives. Second is open-minded and objective inquiry and commitment to truth, which I have been saying several times. The third is constant collaborative reflection, that within the organization, people who are giving direction to the organization, they constantly reflect where they are going and whether they are true to these two first principles. And this would be much better if this reflection is being done in the presence of an external person who can play a devil's advocate. I believe that this kind of internal mechanism will strengthen us. Why am I saying this thing? Civil society organizations will be much more credible if we are in the habit of self-reflecting and clearly remain on the objective side, and perhaps we will be much more effective in that thing. Now, I actually know the NGOs who fall in the category A, as I said, and they are going through this struggle, and perhaps these internal mechanisms help them up to a certain extent. Thank you.
So, over the past few weeks, for obvious reasons, one question that I've personally been asking myself, and I think all of us at CPR, is what is the role, purpose, and impact of independent institutions? And I lead an initiative called Accountability Initiative. So we get asked that question a lot by everyone, saying accountability by whom, to whom, for what? And I think this conference has again reinforced for me the three things that I believe are a critical role that independent institutions play. So thank you so much for organizing this. I think the first role that every independent institution, particularly a lot of the research institutions and think tanks, which is what I know best, is of course the role of knowledge generation. But it's not just knowledge generation itself, because knowledge generation is done by a large number of groups. I think what's unique about the role that independent institutions can play is generating knowledge on things that may not be flavor of the day. It's important to bring to light topics that aren't getting attention. So my colleague Tanya presented some of the work on underreporting of gender-based violence. It's not a sexy topic right now. No one's really talking about it. And I think that's an important thing that institutions can do, of bringing to light things that may not be the focus of the moment of the day. And the reason that we can do that in some ways is because of, as Dr. Reddy said, the multidisciplinary nature of how many of us are designed. It requires multiple approaches, the ability to work across a range of topics. At any given moment, any country is facing a series of complex challenges. And so while it's natural that governments may prioritize certain over others, I think an important role for all of us is to bring to light those that are underreported, not as visible, but yet deeply important. The other thing that I think is really important is ground truthing. And again, what was fascinating is that so much of that came out in the discussions, even the one that we just had just before, the idea of looking at ICDS data, ground truthing that with what's happening on the ground. I think everyone would agree that new ideas spur innovation, but you can't innovate till you know what's working and what's not working. And in fact, government themselves often ask us these questions of, help us ground truth. I remember many years ago sitting in the office of the Ministry of, that time, Human Resource Development, where someone asked us to go and collect data, secondary data as well, not just primary, in education in a few states. And I was really confused. I asked him, but sir, you already have access to all that data. Why should we go and collect it, which will be a pain because we'll need permission letters and we'll have to go to the field? And he said, Avani, I know very well, sitting on top as MHRD, that when I ask for data, the kind of data that I get, or I'm often told what they think I want to hear. And it's for people like you and organizations like you, which can help us verify, course correct, and actually play that important role of trying to spur innovation by knowing what's working and what's not. I think the second area that I think independent institutions play an important role is in brokering ideas and socialization. I think yesterday Aruna ji spoke about how the RTI move, it started off as a campaign, went to a bill, and then finally there was a movement. And it required getting a lot of people across different states to buy into that idea, to also get feedback from everyone to say whether this is going to work or not. Unfortunately, we don't have a billion Aruna Roys in the world, but that's where I think institutions can play an important role, because we do have access and networks. And it's important to validate ideas, it's important to validate policies, it's important to get feedback from different stakeholders. And again, this is something that I think is much needed and an important role that we can all play. The last thing in some ways is an important one, which is we can act as intermediaries between decision makers and those and communities working on the ground. And I think that's again something that came out very, very strongly throughout the day, yesterday as well, but also through some of the presentations that people were discussing. So I think on one hand, one important role that we can play is kind of decoding and simplifying this complex maze called governance. I work a lot on budgets, and they are such technical documents that actually just simplifying them, and it was really nice to see in the audience people who are investigative journalists and media who are taking an interest in budgets now because of different organizations that are working on simplifying often seen as very technical terminologies. But it's also important to do the other side, which is how do you take back your learnings and of communities and give them a voice, which sometimes is difficult to do. So as you were saying, there are so many small NGOs, they may not have access to everyone, and I think that's where independent institutions can play a role of taking their research, their learnings, their voices to important stakeholders across the board. I think we need that. There are a lot of opportunities to do some of these sharing the ground realities. And I think that there is definitely interest as well. As Sarojini ji said, I think a few things that for all the young researchers who are going to probably set up institutions or already have, I think a few lessons that I have learned, and I'm still nascent in this space. One of which is that neither government nor policy making is this monolithic creature. And that's what, as you were saying, there are always, I think it's good to avoid reductionist conversation, and it's always useful to find allies and partners. And we've always been amazed and surprised by it. Not just the example of MHRD, but I remember even in a very, very politically sensitive time when the Swachh Bharat mission was coming to an end, we had people in the district saying, we know that we haven't received open defecation free status. We know that we will need to show that we have achieved open defecation free status, but go out there and tell us what's working, what's not, so that after we have kind of shown the numbers, we can actually work towards it. So there are lots and countless people who are looking for, relying on independent institutions. So I did want to say that there is a positive side to it, even in bleak times. I think the second thing is kind of taking what you're saying, which is it's important to be true to your purpose, definitely. It's very easy to follow the funding. It's very easy to follow the trends of the time. But I think that's when the word independent and institutions and their role gets diminished. So it's not saying it's easy, and you may not be 100% successful, but I think that's another important lesson that I've kind of learned. And that could be by finding allies and partners as well. I also think that what amazed me when I first joined CPR is that it's important to have that when we talk about democratic values and freedom of speech and expression, it's important to inculcate them within organizations as well. So when I first joined, I remember seeing in the Indian Express op-ed pages, different faculty members within CPR saying completely contradictory things, and it was totally okay. In fact, if you see this year's reactions to the union budget, you'll see that there is complete difference of opinion, and that's totally okay. Not saying that anyone is right or wrong, it's totally from where we come from. So when I'm looking at it from a welfare perspective, I think it's not doing enough, but when someone's looking at it from a fiscal stability and macroeconomics perspective, they would think that it's a great budget. And I think having those spaces is definitely critical and important. And I think last but not the least, I think it's very easy to get caught in a trap of saying, we need solutions, we need impact. And I'm not saying that either of those things are not important, but also trust the process. It's not, I'm always hesitant to say, here is a template solution that I think will work across every geography in India, when we know for a fact that that's not true. It's the process of arriving at solutions or thinking through what the challenges are, which have equal merit and value. And so we've also been trying to focus a lot on methodology documentation, rather than saying, this is what you should do. Here are different methods of analyzing a problem and coming up with solutions. So I'll pause here. Thank you so much.
Okay, so kind of overshot time, but can we take about 5 minutes for audience questions? Because I think it would be nice to, I had a question, but I think it would be better because I can speak to you later, but if we can have about just 5 more minutes. Any audience questions? Yes, Prashant. Is there a mic? Yeah. I'm actually not feeling so bad now, because there are so many of these conversations that we've had in the other panels as well about process. So I think it was kind of coming together. So I'm hoping that there is, at some point we will write this up and share it with you, because those of you who missed the other session will know that actually what the speakers kind of spoke about actually coincides a lot and has this sort of nice synthesis and symmetry, which is always useful. No mic?
Yes. Oh. One question and one reflection, just to
introduce yourself, Prashanti.
Yeah, I'm Prashanti, representing Bhumika Women's Collective, coming from Telangana, Hyderabad. Just Sarojini, you mentioned about TRIF and the social justice system that has been introduced by TRIF. I would actually recall the Nari Adalats that are started by Mahila Samakhya much before that. So how we promote those models as models and interact with government to take it as a model and replicate across the country is very important. That's what I think Mahila Samakhya lost. The other point, it's a question actually. Institutions, small institutions, sustainability. When it comes to small organizations started by women, and women-headed NGOs are in a big trouble now, especially with the FCRA rules and not having local funds, sufficient local funds, or CSR, tapping the CSR funds. So how would we deal with this situation, and how you see what can be done for helping the small women-headed institutions to sustain themselves?
Thank you, Prashanti. We'll take 2 more questions and then we'll get to the panel. Yes, sir. Please introduce yourself and ask the question.
Yeah, this is Shashank. I'm a PhD scholar here at NIAS. I have been keenly listening to all the speakers. Interesting notes, but I also wanted to ask if any of them would be willing to reflect on what is the spaces captured by independent institutions in the policy domain that make it much more difficult for the civil society groups to work and push for their agendas, and what is the relationship between civil society groups, movements, public movements, people's movements, and institutions as well.
Okay. One more question. Anyone else? Okay, I think the panel can respond. Anyone prefers to respond?
I can
No?
take one question, but
Sure.
there's others. So
Okay.
maybe you should take the women's question.
Okay, I'll try. What you said is very true. I mean, at the moment, the space for getting finance is definitely shrinking. We know the whole regulation around FCRA has become more stringent. But actually, what is slightly, I don't know, my personal experience has not, my own has not been very positive, but I know people who have actually worked on trying to capitalize on CSR. Now, my own experience of CSR has been that quite a lot of organizations want either big ticket items where they can say they're funding so many things, so it becomes more difficult for a small NGO, or they give money to PM Cares or something where they can show they've given it. But actually, if you have in your vicinity, CSR is something which now, because they're bound by law and rules and the rules say that if there's something in your locality, it's a good thing, it's one thing. The second thing is if your collective is registered under, I mean, if it's one of the collectives which is recognized under NRLM, there's a big push this year actually about funding individual women and making each one, I mean, theoretical, but they're trying to work towards it. This for the first time they have gender, is trying to make each woman member what they call Lakpati. And as a result, the levels of loaning and thing are theoretically, I've not seen it in practice yet, supposed to go up. But so, I mean, I really don't know what buttons you can push, but those are the ones that come to mind immediately. And I would just say there are people in this room who would probably be much better equipped to give you some sort of advice. If anybody else can add to what I'm saying, that would be useful. You had something you wanted to say?
Well, let me take up the question on people's movements and independent organizations, what relationship they can have. Is it a conflicting relationship that somebody is taking up somebody else's space, or is it a complementary relationship? They're working together towards a common objective. I believe it should be the latter, and if it's not, we must remedy that situation. Clearly, there are different roles that each organization can play. Independent institutions which are creating knowledge, translating knowledge, and critiquing knowledge, or evaluating the application of knowledge, will come up with perspectives based on whatever evidence they've gathered and analyzed. But the message must actually be widely disseminated through the media, through all other channels, so that the people who are engaged much more in the front lines, in people's movements, will have both the ammunition for their arguments and adequate amount of information on which they can build popular movements. Ultimately, policymakers will usually respond, are supposed to respond to two types of approaches. One is the cognitive element, where you can give them a lot of information, particularly if it's an economics-based argument. But you also need an emotive component, where there is a clear-cut factor of some group being clearly disadvantaged, or there is an outrage factor of popular discontent being voiced. I mean, for example, tobacco, nobody bothered about tobacco till second-hand smoke came up. And when it was found that people who are non-smokers were getting hurt, the outrage built up. So I think it's absolutely important for us to act in unison, so that people who are in independent institutions who are actually conducting the research or translating the research see themselves as informed facilitators of popular movements and pass on that message and assist them in amplifying it further and ensuring that there is a response. I think that is the element. Coming back to FCRA, it's a terrible situation, but one possible way in which you can get around it, and I suppose there is no government person in IB taking notes, is that firstly, if there is a large NGO which is getting a grant, it cannot share it with another NGO, even if it is FCRA registered under the new rules. But work can be contracted out, and that money can be paid for. Or some people can be employed to work with that NGO, but paid directly by the NGO which has got the grant. So you'll have to work around some of those mechanisms if possible, but certainly that's only a solution which is not most comfortable. So we'll have to try and see how we can try and ask for and get the FCRA rules amended in a more meaningful fashion. But till that time, these are possibilities.
Would anyone else like to respond to any of the questions?
I think Dr. Reddy was going to respond to the complementarity, and I think you said it better than I can. So.
Actually, I was going to say the same thing, that the one of the things that I think in the health session was very clear is that, the idea of, and the thing is in this panel, so if I can summarize in 2 minutes, in this panel, and especially in the last, I think the entire 2 days, if I have to say that what I have learned is that the inclusion of something doesn't necessarily mean the exclusion of something else. And the thing is, a lot of the conversations yesterday also spoke about the value of diversity and the value of engaging with diversity of organizations, and not necessarily, so independent organizations come in all forms, just like, civil society organizations come in all forms, and social movements come in all forms. They're not necessarily, if you look at any kind of social movements, they're not necessarily internally all the time progressive either, right? So the kinds of ideas that you bring forward, who speaks, and you may, I know you are laughing, but the thing is, there are a lot of conversations around, for example, gender caste conversations within, for example, certain kinds of social movements that are not always articulated. And I'm not saying this coming from an independent institution. I'm talking to you from the voices of the people I have spoken to. And that is the role of the independent organization, is to be able to say, yes, you're right, absolutely. And the thing is, the panel has been saying it. And the thing is, something that I think is always so important for all of us to engage with is the criticality of self-reflection, and the idea that there needs to be a sort of a way in which, and I'll go back to, again, the health question about, our commitment in some ways. And the thing is, the commitment to social change and what that means. And so if that means that we are, and I applaud you for that question, if that means we have to hold ourselves accountable to someone whom we are getting who we feel are the communities we are interacting with, that's absolutely something that we need to be accountable to as well. And holding ourselves accountability is something that is one of our responsibilities. And I think that's what I'm assuming, referring to. And that, I think, is something that we have been sort of having a conversation about, that whether it's with gender, with health, and I'm assuming with public finance and with education, is, like you said, who is it that we're accountable to? And these are questions we ask of ourselves, and we need to ask of communities as well. Everyone is implicated by power, right? And so that's, when we talk about intersectionality, that's what we mean, that everybody is implicated by power, and so are we. And I think one of the really learnings, and I'm going to take 2 minutes to just, talk about at least what I have learned in the panel as well as in the last 2 days, is one, the importance of public good. Second, I've already spoke about diversity. And then, of course, what that also means is diversity of methods, multidisciplinarity, multiple lenses, right? So we tend to kind of focus, and one of the most amazing things about, for me at least, was that I was sitting on panels that I had, very limited disciplinary lens understanding, and yet I was able to see how, the way in which Professor Srinath said that the person who's experiencing lived experiences does not see it in different disciplinary lenses, right? we see it together. And in a lot of ways, if you can engage with knowledge in that form, in the way that it's very complicated and it is complex, and yet what the panel, I feel, was trying to say is that there is a clarity in that complexity. There needs to be clarity. And one of the roles of independent organizations, in collaboration with governing bodies, in collaboration with social movements, in collaboration with the other actors who are forming the social space, is to bring certain forms of clarity and voice to that complexity. Because there are multiple voices. There is no singular voice out there, and we do need to have that voice captured. The other thing that I felt was very useful is, Rohit Dhankar's conversation, and I thought of this as a Socratic method of, constantly asking why. Why does this happen? And, the reflection and the open-mindedness, and to be able to have, honestly, the courage to be answering that question as well, right? So if someone is asking that question, saying, you have to be held accountable for what you're saying, to be able to say, okay, that's something that, we will take responsibility for, but also asking questions around, Professor Srinath in his previous said, there are multiple truths out there. There isn't a one singular holistic sort of truth. And to be able to find those, as what you were saying, to diversity of truths, but maybe perhaps, nuance that a little bit and not say diversity of opinions, right? Because that constantly becomes the thing where you say, I believe this, and so therefore that could be the truth. But, there is a system, and there is a method, and there is a process to truth telling and to understanding the multiple truths that are out there. And that, I think, is what I think a lot of conversation around rigor comes around, about when multiple people are saying this, how do you cut across a lot of the noise, a lot of the conversation, and really articulate what communities want, what women want, what marginalized people want, and perhaps also cutting across government documents, because sometimes cutting through that, I have seen, I am in a budget organization, so I know exactly what you mean when you say the numbers can be very heavy, and I'm sure a lot of people who have to deal with it are smiling, but there is a sense in which we can cut through that and arrive at not perhaps simple solutions, but at least ones that might work. And I think the idea of expanding the engagement, not just with government, but with different ways of, I like the idea of ally making, right? And the very, especially in the gender session, we were talking about how do we engage with different kinds of diverse identities. And ally making seems, when I came across that word, because, you come across that you're a gender ally, which means that you may be implicated by the invisibility of privilege that is inhabited in your body and your identity, but you can still be an ally, that you can still move from your subject position to inhabit someone else's world, to be able to say, I can work with, not just I can work with you, but I can, your interests are also actually in my self-interest. And to be having that commitment also means to see public policy as a political act. And I think if Jyotsna was here, and I'm sorry I didn't announce this earlier, she's a little unwell, which is why she's also not moderating this panel, but I think she would agree with me that for us, at least at CBPS, we do see this as a public policy, as a political act. Regardless of whether that is formulating the questions, what questions to ask, what are the methods that we use, who do we engage with when we ask these questions, how do we represent, because representation is a big thing in terms of writing. How do we represent them, who do we talk to, and as Anita was pointing out in our previous session, do we take this back to our communities, or do they become part of that process of policy making? Those are questions of, those are political decisions, those are not necessarily. So in that sense, I think you've given us actually a lot of things to think about, and I think the last point that I'd like to say is that I think your conversations around the importance of absent actors, who is not present here, who is not part of this conversation, is also, I think it has been something that we have been conscious of, but it is something that we can continue to be very vigilant about, is who, the importance of absent actors in forming the social space is actually quite pivotal in allowing us to understand that social space. So your conversations around space and time, that, a lot of things change. For example, women, when provided space and time, women, have the abilities to figure out their own kind of resolutions, have the ability to understand their own social worlds with, great ease. I think that's also something that we can be committed to, is to give ourselves some space and time to critique, to advocate, and as we were saying, to be able to make visible that which is not right now. So I thank you for your immense contributions, not just today in this panel, but also in directing the conversations in the other panels. And thank you so much for participating in our conversation. Thank you.